Welcome to the Greenwich Sentinel's Video News. I'm Taylor Knight. Over the next hour here on GCTV, we will have the latest news stories, sports coverage, and interviews with the people who make Greenwich great. I am here with Senator Richard Blumenthal. Thank you so much for taking time out of your hectic schedule to come to the Sentinel office.
Well, thank you, Taylor.
Absolutely. So we'll get into it. You've been involved with politics for quite some time. Can you give me a brief overview of all that?
I first ran for office in 1984 as a state representative in Stamford. Then I was a state senator and attorney general for 20 years before becoming a United States senator about 5.5 years ago. But I had been the U.S. attorney for Connecticut. I worked in the White House under Pat Moynihan when he was an assistant to President Nixon. And I also was a law clerk to Justice Harry Blackmun on the United States Supreme Court. So I had a number of appointed positions before I ran for elective office.
Great. And which one of those experiences do you think really prepared you for your role right now?
That is a great question. I have a theory, which is that people learn most from great mentors, people they want to emulate in life. And I had some terrific mentors. Harry Blackmun, as a Supreme Court justice, really infused me with a love of precision and articulateness and legal expression. Pat Moynihan was a consummate speaker and thinker, very original, but also very loyal and dedicated. And I also had the opportunity to work briefly for Abe Ribicoff, the senator from Connecticut, who gave me some insights about elective politics. So the combination of those three individuals, as much as the experiences, really taught me a tremendous amount. And then as Attorney General for the state of Connecticut, I really put to work my instincts and intellectual qualities, such as they are, in fighting for the people of Connecticut, using that job to be an advocate, to go to bat for people who needed a voice and needed someone to fight for them and work for them.
And why is it important to have someone like that for people?
People as individuals often lack the confidence in themselves and the knowledge about their legal rights to put them to good use. And their legal rights may be more expansive than they realize. When people say there ought to be a law, in fact, there often is a law. And sometimes it is unenforced for the benefit of the public. So in consumer protection, for example, in fighting the tobacco industry, in fact, suing the tobacco industry and leading nationally attorneys general to sue the tobacco industry so that we could recover not only money, but also change the way they marketed to children. I was using established law. We didn't make a new law. We enforced consumer protection laws that require honest and truthful labeling of products and statements to the public. So when the tobacco company said, we don't market a product to children, we don't have a product that kills people or injures them, they were basically lying. We sued them for it, and we settled the case for billions of dollars, but also to change their marketing practices, to educate the public, and to use it as a forum to create more awareness about the dangers of smoking and the costs, not only of families who suffered loved ones who were lost to cancer, but also the costs of health care, because we all pay for cancer, lung disease, heart problems that are caused by smoking through our insurance. So the effort, just one of a number that I undertook as Attorney General, to enforce the law, make it real, I think was a very sort of illuminating experience for me and led me to much of what I do now in fighting for people and trying to use the law as well as change the law for the better.
And speaking of tobacco, CVS just embarked on a mission to spend $50 million?
Yes.
And what is that all about? You had a part in that.
This effort by CVS is very, very encouraging. They are taking a stand and stepping up to recognize that there are pharmaceutical drugs, medicines, medications that can help people quit. The more we know about tobacco addiction, it's really nicotine addiction, which is one of the most powerful addictive drugs known to man, the more we realize that it's a combination of counseling and often medication, the patch and other devices that can help people break this addiction. And often that addiction will begin at childhood when people are unaware of the consequences and of the powerfully addictive qualities of nicotine. So what CVS is doing by making available these drugs, by refusing to sell tobacco products, is, in my view, very courageous and visionary. They are doing really what is best about our private enterprise, which is not only increasing their bottom line, but also doing well by their customers. And I'm not doing an ad for CVS, but my hope is that others will emulate what they are doing. And I should just say I've done a lot of work also on another form of addiction, opioid and heroin addiction, where Walgreens is undertaking to sell a very important drug that often can save people, Narcan, naloxone. They are helping in that area of public health. So I want to balance what I say about CVS with Walgreens, and what they represent is really doing good as well as doing well. And that's what a lot of people in the Greenwich community who are successful in business do as well. They have a very strong sense of giving back, social and personal responsibility, as well as business success.
Greenwich is also doing a study on heroin use and who's doing it, why they start doing it. Why is that important to do it in this community?
It's important in every community. When I began in law enforcement as the U.S. Attorney for Connecticut, I was the chief federal prosecutor. Crack, cocaine, heroin were found primarily in the inner cities in terms of use and addiction. The incidence of heroin now is all over Connecticut in communities like Greenwich and Farmington and West Hartford, relatively affluent, rural communities, Litchfield, and very urban communities still, like the downtowns of Bridgeport and Hartford. It is an epidemic sweeping this country, causing 16,000 deaths a year in 2013. It's grown dramatically since. We don't have the most recent numbers. 125 people a day, and 735 people dying from overdoses in last year in Connecticut alone. So what we face is a public health hurricane and a lot of denial about it, especially in communities like Greenwich. Oh, it's not happening here. That's Bridgeport's problem. That denial and the stigma that is attached to addiction are a very horrendous hurdle that has to be overcome. And so I have spearheaded, literally this week, passed yesterday in the United States Senate by an overwhelming majority, bipartisan, a measure called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, which provides more treatment, support for law enforcement. We need to support our police and prosecutors, but we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. There has to be more treatment, and particularly inpatient treatment, and more of the medication, Suboxone, for example, that can help people break this addiction, very powerful. And it often begins, and this is why it's so especially important in this community, with a young person breaking an arm or an ankle, having surgery or wisdom teeth removed, and receiving Vicodin, Percocet, OxyContin, powerful opioid painkillers that can lead to addiction. The most common risk factor for heroin addiction is the use of opioid prescription painkillers. And so when a doc says to a young person, I know you're going to be in a lot of pain after this surgery, after we put your broken arm in a cast or whatever it is, and here's a prescription for 30 pills. That's a lot of painkillers when 3 may be enough. In fact, 3 may be unnecessary. So those extra pills either create addiction, or they are on the streets sold, or they are kept in a medicine cabinet where they're a catastrophe waiting to happen. So some of what the bill does is provide for more education and training, access to the state registry that can monitor who is prescribing what. This issue is one of the most pressing of our time, and I have held roundtables all around the state of Connecticut, literally in every community, every kind of community, and we've had law enforcement officials, treatment providers, docs, educators, and recovering addicts, and their parents. And what is so gripping to me is the stories of those recovering addicts and their families about how their lives have been shattered. And that's true in Greenwich. All you need to do is have someone talk candidly about their friends or neighbors, their colleagues at work. We've all been touched in one way or another by this problem of opioid addiction. It is an epidemic. I know that's an overused word, but it is like a public health hurricane, as much a natural disaster as tornadoes or floods would be in terms of its impact. And the largest cause of death, injury-related death in this country, is no longer car crashes, it's heroin addiction and overdose.
And you said almost everyone's been touched by this issue. Why do you think it took until now for this bill to get passed and people to get talking about it, even Greenwich doing a study about it?
There's a tipping point, I think, when, in terms of social consciousness, enough people become aware of a problem that politically it's okay to discuss. And I've been talking about this issue for quite a while in championing this bill in the Judiciary Committee. I am on the Judiciary Committee. It began as a law enforcement bill, but criminal justice reform is insufficient as a solution to this problem. In fact, there is no one panacea. It has to be multifaceted: law enforcement, treatment, Narcan, naloxone, which brings people back from the brink of death when they overdose, and removing the stigma. Addiction is an illness. It's a form of disease that can be conquered, but it has to be treated without the stigma and shame that prevents people from coming forward and seeking that treatment. And we've done, as a matter of fact, the roundtables with some of the recovering addicts who are very brave and very smart and very articulate, and simply began down this road, potentially ruining their lives, and they are working their way back.
That's great. And now, besides tobacco and opioid abuse, what other issues are you feeling strongly about right now?
Well, that's a very good question as well. You know, what I think is so important right now is that we continue investing in jobs and economic growth, which has been my priority from day one in the United States Senate. Jobs and economic growth. We need to invest in rails, roads, bridges, which creates jobs. Metro North and Amtrak are vital to moving people to their jobs and creating an environment economically here in the state of Connecticut that will attract more job-creating businesses. Better roads. Our roads are decaying. And bridges. We know what happened literally almost a stone's throw from here at the Mianus River Bridge. That could happen again. The Norwalk Walk Bridge that is stuck and prevents train travel, that bridge was built at the end of the 1900s when Grover Cleveland was president. And it dates from a time when those bridges were built in different ways, and it stuck often in the summer, and it ties up rail traffic up and down the East Coast. So we need to invest, create more jobs. I'm on the transportation science, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. transportation is a big part of what I do, but investment in jobs. And another way to invest is college affordability. We need to reduce the amount of college debt in this country, $1.2 trillion. That's an overhang and a drag our entire economy, because young people coming out of college with $60,000 or $100,000 in debt can't buy new homes, can't begin families or start businesses. Their futures are narrowed, and that means our future as a nation is constricted. So we have a plan. I've helped to lead it, a bill that has been introduced that will provide for more grants like Pell Grants, scholarships, financial aid that will enable people to avoid debt. For those who have that debt, often paying 7 or 8% interest rate, this measure would help them refinance. Right now, unlike a car loan or a mortgage, people often cannot go to refinance their debt at lower interest rates. You can do it with a car, you can do it with a home, usually not with a college debt
Not with your
involving the federal
education.
government. And then people who need debt or loans now, lower interest rates. But my sort of mission in this college affordability business is not only to enable people to go to school without debt, it's also, number one, lower the costs of college tuition. And number two, enable people who have debt now to work it off through public service. Why shouldn't someone who is a policeman or a firefighter in Greenwich, or a teacher in our local school system, or working at the YMCA or the YW, be able to receive credit financially for the great work that they do? And so I would, in effect, reward public service, much as we have the GI Bill, which rewards service in the military. I have two sons who have served in the military, and I know a lot of people who've used the GI Bill, and my sons may not have done it because they went into the military after going to college, but it's a great way for young people to finance their college education or their graduate education, and that ought to be true of people who have debt and do public service in the civilian area afterward.
And what do you think needs to happen for that type of thing to happen?
We need a bill to be passed. I proposed it. I hope there'll be a bipartisan majority for it, as there was for the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. I've worked very hard on that bill to make it bipartisan, as we did on certain veterans issues. I am the ranking member on the Veterans Affairs Committee, so I've been very much involved in veterans health care, providing job opportunities, tax credits to businesses that hire more veterans. I've championed more skill training for our veterans, because there are jobs for a lot of people, but not enough people with the right skills. And that's what I hear from businesses as I go around the state. We have jobs, we can't find people with the right skills. We need to train our veterans to do it. So we championed a bill, bipartisan bill, that provides more opportunities and reforms health care through greater choice on the part of those veterans. That kind of bipartisanship reaching across the aisle is critical to college affordability, just as it was to the transportation bill that we passed, the elementary and secondary education bill that we passed. It is possible to get things done in Washington, believe it or not, if you focus on the mission and you make it bipartisan.
And what national issues should people in Greenwich be concerned with?
I think the world is a very dangerous place, so I hope people will understand what's happening with ISIS and ISIL. We're at war with them, with it. We need to be mindful about the importance of a strong national defense. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the Joint Strike Fighter, submarine force, undersea warfare capability, about helicopters, and about how we attract the best and the brightest of this generation to serve, because we can talk and talk and talk about our military hardware, but at the end of the day, it's the excellence of our people serving in the military. They are our greatest asset that gives us a strong national defense. So I hope that people in Greenwich will think about the importance of public service, and particularly our veterans, service in the military, the importance of a strong national defense, investment in jobs and economic growth, transportation, college affordability, and the need to also, and I'll make this kind of a last point, to reform our immigration system, which is broken and seriously needs reform. I worked very, very hard on an immigration reform bill in the last session of Congress that was approved overwhelmingly by a bipartisan majority and would enable us to correct this broken system. And unfortunately, it never received a vote in the House of Representatives. Passed the Senate, never got a vote in the House. I want to bring back that bill so we can improve our immigration system, enable people who are now working and living peacefully and obeying all the rules to come out of the shadows and have a path to earned, I stress earned, citizenship. More H-1B visas, reform the abuses in that system. This bill attracted a coalition of business, labor, Republican, Democrat. That's the kind of measure that I hope we can do.
And in the presidential race right now, speaking of immigration, there's been some racially charged things said. What do you have to say about that?
I really find it reprehensible. But talk about excluding a religious group from entering this country. Not only sends the wrong message to people who live here, but also to peoples and nations abroad. Some of them are our allies. A lot of them are engaged in the fight against extremism and violent terrorism abroad. We should be shoulder to shoulder with them, not excoriating an entire racial or religious group. And so I am really saddened by it and hope that the public dialogue can be raised to a higher level. And I'm saddened also, as someone who's been involved in the political world for a while, by the incivility of our public discourse. I have friends and family who are Republicans. We ought to be able to work together, and that's what I try to do literally every day in the United States Senate. Some of my great friends are across the aisle, and we can joke, whether it's in the Senate gym at 5:30 in the morning or on the floor of the Senate or at lunch or dinner, about what we have in common and where we disagree. And we ought to be able to get along and maximize where we agree to get things done.
And what do you hope to see in the future?
I hope to see, number one, a confirmation of a Supreme Court justice in the immediate future. The President will nominate someone. I hope the Judiciary Committee will give that person a hearing. I'm on the Judiciary Committee. And I hope that we'll confirm a Supreme Court justice because the country deserves it. It's our job. The public rightly wants us to do our job. I'm going to be one of the toughest questioners and scrutinize very closely whoever the President appoints. I have no idea as we sit here who it will be. That person deserves to be scrutinized before they're appointed for a lifetime on the United States Supreme Court. But let's approach the person on the merits, not just reject that person sight unseen. And that's what it means to advise and consent. That's our constitutional duty. We ought to do our job, and I hope the President shortly will propose someone.
And in doing your job, can you tell me about an average day down in Washington?
An average day is running from one hearing or meeting or group to another, always having to be in 2 or 3 places at the same time, because I'm on 4 committees, and they're all likely meeting and having hearings at the same time. So Armed Services will have a hearing on our defense in the the South Pacific or wherever on our undersea warfare capability, and that's of great interest to me because we produce submarines and electric boat. I want to go to that hearing. And Judiciary Committee will be having a hearing on our criminal justice system, and Veterans Affairs will be having a hearing on the effort to reform healthcare, and the Commerce, Science, and Technology Committee will be having a hearing on railroads. Not all exactly at the same time, but a lot of them meet together, so I'm running from one to another, or meeting with constituents who are coming down to Connecticut, or colleagues that have a common interest, as I do, in college affordability. How are we going to craft this bill? And so a lot at the same time. It's a whirl of motion.
It sounds very difficult. How do you deal with it all?
You know, I like being active, and I like asking questions. I like to do cross-examination when I was a lawyer, a prosecutor. So I like the hearings, and the great part of this job is I get to help people. So the best part of the day is reaching out to an agency or an insurance company or someone else that is not doing right by somebody from Connecticut, and going to bat for that person and saying to the head of the insurance company, you know, you really shouldn't be denying coverage for this medical procedure, or saying to the VA, you know, you shouldn't be denying a disability claim from this veteran, or the Social Security bureaucracy. You shouldn't be denying the benefits that this person is entitled to. And we go to bat for people, whether it's in a private company or a big government bureaucracy. We go to bat for people and fight for them. That's the common element of what I did as Attorney General and what I do now, and that's really the best part of my day.
And you're not afraid to do that.
I've been doing it for a while, and I'm not afraid to do it.
Great. And now we'll switch to an average day when you get to be back in Connecticut. What do you enjoy doing?
Well, I love being back in Connecticut. I'd rather be in Connecticut than down in D.C. I will start in Greenwich, where I live, and after I work out, I will go to Bridgeport for a meeting there. For example, today to celebrate the passage of the FAST Act, actually in North Haven, with 250 contractors, unions, businesses that will receive money to do more construction. And then to Hartford for a celebration of the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. We went to a farm that makes maple syrup, because a lot of the food distributors or manufacturers are using the term maple when they have no maple syrup. Misleading and deceptive advertising. So we went there, I went there to learn more about how they make maple syrup and how the mislabeling affects this maple syrup producer. It doesn't sound like a big issue, but if you buy certain cereals or certain ice cream or certain cookies, and it has the word label, or the label maple, you should look at the ingredients to make sure that it actually is made with maple syrup. That's just a small consumer protection example, because we also, just in the past couple of days, did a call, and in that instance we called on the FDA to crack down on this practice. So every one of these issues has an action component, and we've called on the airlines, for example, to end the add-on fees for baggage, for pillows, for seat changes, for reservation changes, provide more legroom. And I've called on the Department of Transportation and the FAA to take action, and went to Bradley Airport to talk to some of the officials there, consumer protection and consumer union officials, about what is needed. So the average day involves seeing people, meeting people, going around the state. There are very few days when I'm back here that I don't go up and down the coast as far as New London or to Hartford or to Litchfield County, and many days it's all of the above.
And what is your favorite part about being back in Greenwich?
My family, my wife and family, if our children are around. I love Greenwich as a community. It has such diversity in people, smart people, and very socially aware and generous people. And I think my favorite part of Greenwich is the people, beginning with my family, and then friends that we have, really good friends here, people who are immensely loyal and caring.
Great. And how can people contact you if they are having a problem?
Well, we have a website. Hopefully you'll put it up. I'm endlessly giving out my cell phone number, but people can contact me personally at our website. And my personal email is richard@blumenthal.senate.gov, G-O-V. So there are a lot of ways to get hold of me, by phone or by email. And I encourage people, by the way, to contact me. You are doing me a favor if you contact me. You are enabling me to do my job. You are giving me the opportunity to do what I love most, which is working for people and fighting for them, especially if they feel they have nowhere else to turn. They're up against some big corporation or government bureaucracy or some powerful interest, and people say, I just can't seem to get any justice here. That's when I love to go to work for people.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I really appreciate it.
I'm delighted and honored to be with you. Thank you, Taylor.
Again, Senator Richard Blumenthal, and for the Greenwich Sentinel, I'm Taylor Knight. I'm sitting here with Jim Lash, former First Selectman and current chairman of the BET Budget Committee. Thanks for stopping by today.
Sure.
All right, first question. Just give me a brief overview about yourself, a little bit of history about you.
Well, I've done a lot of different things over the years. I started out as an aerospace engineer working on the Apollo program, and then I was a consultant primarily to city governments in Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, New Orleans, so big cities for the most part, but New Haven, Ann Arbor, Michigan. And then in 1976, I started what we would now call a private equity business. I've been in that business ever since.
Great, and can you talk to me, I hear you're a rocket scientist.
Yeah,
Can you
right.
talk to me more about that?
Well, that was a lot of fun. You know, it was the sort of height of the Cold War, and President Kennedy had decided we needed to get to the moon, and people my age were signing up to become aerospace engineers. I went to MIT and studied there, and MIT was designing the guidance system for the command module, the piece that went into orbit around the moon. And I worked on that program while I was at MIT, and then I worked on the first stage booster rocket, which was being built in New Orleans because it was too big. It had to be transported by water to the Cape to be launched.
Wow.
So I stayed in the program until the program was, we were on the moon, and you know, then they started laying people off, and there were 400,000 of us working on that program, and they had a lot of people to lay off. And I didn't get laid off. I found other work before my number came up, but it surely would have come up.
And how do you think that prepared you to work in Greenwich for Greenwich Town Government?
Yeah, it's just like that. Well, I think that kind of project teaches you a lot about the problems of coordinating large numbers of people who don't see each other every day and don't necessarily see the problems the same way. So you learn to work with people that you can't always have a personal relationship with. And you learn to pay attention to what the data says rather than just somebody's opinion about something, because particularly in aerospace engineering, if you don't pay attention to the data, people die.
Yes.
And hopefully that won't happen in Greenwich, but that's, so you learn to work with the numbers. So people used to joke about me when I was on the BET in the early 2000s that I would look at people and say, I'm just doing math here. I just need to understand where this comes from. And they were sure I was up to something, you know, and I would have to keep saying, no, I'm just doing the math. I just want to figure out the math. Most of life turns out to be sort of second and third grade math.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, not calculus. Not a lot of calculus
Good.
in life.
I wasn't very good at calculus.
Yeah, well, that's okay.
And your father had an interesting job, I was told.
Yeah, well, my father, who grew up on a farm in Michigan and finished his schooling going to school nights, after the Depression, he went to work for General Motors, and his first job was sitting on a high stool in a factory floor, counting the number of pieces that were being produced on a particular machine that would go into military equipment, because it was the early 40s, it was World War II. And from that, he learned to work with unions and union members, because of course the auto industry had unionized by that time, and there'd been a lot of violence and conflict in the unionization process. And he taught me to respect unions and respect people who worked for a living, and not have, again, sort of classic stereotypical views of what it's like to work with unions.
And did his job kind of play on you, the efficiency part of it?
Well, you know, I suppose it did, although this is going to sound a little funny, but yeah, I'm not mostly thinking about efficiency. I'm thinking about what's going to work best, which is kind of the engineer in me. You know, at MIT people say, you know, we're engineers. What we do is figure out how to solve problems. There was a problem at MIT 15 years ago or so when it had become apparent that the women who were full professors weren't really being treated like the men were. And they produced a kind of a typical MIT report with lots of numbers in it to illustrate the problem. Yeah. And, you know, people kind of said, but what can we do about this? And the guy who at the time was the provost said, look, we're engineers. These are problems. We solve problems. We'll find a way to solve this problem. And they set about doing things. It made the front page of the New York Times at the time, but that's pretty typical.
Now, we'll move on to the BET. Why did you at first want to join the BET?
Well, I had been on the library board, and the library board has term limits, and my term was running out, and a woman named Alice Melly, who was then the chair of the BET, suggested that I think about being on the BET. But I obviously hadn't been paying much attention because she neglected to tell me, and I neglected to realize that I had to get nominated and elected to the BET. I thought it was like getting appointed. So I, you know, once I realized that and not knowing any better, I set about campaigning in the way you campaign to get nominated, by talking to the people who were members of the Republican Town Committee. And it turned out there were 7 of us, I think, running for the 6 seats. And so kind of like musical chairs, you know, 6 people get a seat. And as it turned out, in that particular round, 2 new people got seats, myself and a guy who had been first selectman, and a man who was chair of the budget committee and had been there for 18 years got bumped off. I never asked him how that happened because, you know, there was no obvious reason for that to happen, but, you know, I think it hadn't occurred to him that he had to campaign. He was so well known and he knew people, right. And you know, so John Margonaut and I went on to BET, and that other fellow went off. I think we were all kind of surprised with that result. So that's how I got there.
And then first selectman.
Yeah, so I had said that I would serve 2 terms on the finance board, and so I served the 2 terms, and so I knew I was going to go off. And somebody came to me and said, you know, it would be good, given all the change we had implemented in the prior few years in the BET, if you would think about being first selectman. And it was just a point in time in my business life when I could take a break from it. It was a business I had started anyway, and there were people who could carry on with what we were doing for a few years. And so the timing worked, and I was intrigued by the possibility. And so I ran, and there were 4 or 5 of us running for first selectman, which, you know, a little like watching the Republicans now. You know you're going to get a small percentage of the vote because there are just so many people running. Yeah. Sam Romeo was running, who's now the head of the Housing Authority, and Dick Bergstresser, who was the sitting first selectman, and me, Mr. Riley, who ran again recently. Yep. So yeah, it was. We had I think we had 8 or 10 debates, which was tiring, because unlike the presidential thing, which goes on for years, this was sort of concentrated, sort of between Labor Day and Election Day. Right. So it was pretty intense, and not at all obvious how it was going to come out. But in the end, I was elected.
And looking back at your time as first selectman, what's something that pops out in your brain that you really remember?
Well, I think probably the thing that I remember is that I came in and I had a pretty clear idea of what things I wanted to get done, and I felt like if I didn't get them done pretty quickly, we'd be into the next election cycle, because it's only a 2-year term, right? It's sort of like being a congressman. You're sort of always running. So Ed Goma was the controller, and I wanted to move Ed over to become the town administrator. There hadn't been a town administrator in a long time, so we kind of recreated that position. And we did a couple of other things. One of the things we did was I got the guy who was then the superintendent of schools actually, I think on my first day in office, and I said to him, we need to go look at the Hamilton Avenue School because you have a problem there. Well, he knew he had a problem, but he didn't have any way to solve it because he didn't have any money. And so we went and looked at it, and I said, yeah, that's what a problem looks like. We have to go get some money. And so then he had an ally who understood how the money gets appropriated in town, which, you know, he hadn't been here all that long, so he wasn't sure. So he and I then went back to the finance board and the RTM and got some money so that they could start coming to a conclusion about what to do about it. In the end, the conclusion was build a new school, but we didn't know that the day we started out. So there was that, and there was getting Ed Gomo in, and then the other thing that happened, which is certainly not funny, was that on my 5th day in office, which was the 5th of December, because we started the 1st of December, there was a fire in town. And it was snowing, and there were 5 or 6 inches of snow, and it was soggy, and it was just a terrible kind of night. It would have been a bad night for snow plowing and everything else anyway. And there's this fire, and we end up with several firefighters in the hospital as the result of that fire. So then I spend the night going to the hospital and meeting their families and making sure that they're going to be okay, though they were pretty badly injured. And then I go to snow dispatch, which is the office down by exit 4, where the public works people dispatch the snow plows, and they looked at me when I came in and said, what are you doing here? Wondering why I was still out and about on a night like that. And so we went out and spent some time watching that process. So I'd been in office 5 days. In my view, I'd had a year's worth of trouble already. And turned out it wasn't a whole year's worth, but it was a good start. So I remember the first week pretty well.
So you were very hands-on.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I learned from my father, and that I learned from being in the consulting business for a while, is that if you want to understand what's going on, you have to go see the thing and meet the people and listen to what they tell you about what the problem is and gather the data. So, I wasn't telling people how to fight the fire that night, but I was there to see how they fought the fire, and I learned a lot from that. It started out, got to be a bad fire very quickly. There were, in addition to the career guys, when you get a bad fire like that, you get a lot of the volunteers there, so there were a lot of vehicles. GEMS was there with their vehicles, and it wasn't chaotic, I don't mean that, but it was a lot going on all at one time. And the fire department always debriefs a fire like that after the fact to see what lessons they can learn from it. And I think that fire with the guys getting injured caused them to think about how they could have done that differently and maybe influence the way they went forward.
Interesting. And now back to the BET.
Yeah, okay.
Why'd you join again?
So I saw that the man who was the chair of the budget committee wasn't going to run again, and that was the job I had when I was on the BET. And I like that job. It's a place where you can either keep things from happening or help things happen. You have to have, well, it helps to have experience, and I have experience, and you need to have a kind of, not so much a point of view, but a way of thinking about the problems. So if you look at we're currently engaged in this new Lebanon school issue, and the question is, how much should we spend to build an elementary school? It isn't so much a question of whether the cost estimate for the school that's been designed is right or not. People will get that number to be right for the school that was designed. The question is that the school we ought to be building? Why are we building such a big school? Well, in part, we're building such a big school because of the state rules about diversity in the schools. And why are we doing it now? Why weren't we doing it 4 or 5 years ago? Because we talked about it 4 or 5 years ago. But what set of circumstances caused mostly the Board of Ed, because that's where these start, to take so long to get us to this point? So now we're kind of in a rush, under pressure we wouldn't have been under 4 or 5 years ago. Back to why is it so big? Partly to meet the requirements for the diversity program, but still seems too big. So if the budget is $40 million in round numbers and the original estimate was $32 million, what caused that change? Well, the building's big. Why is it so big? Well, it isn't just for the students we have there now, and it isn't even just for the students that would come if we could get other children to transfer into that school in order to meet the state's requirements on diversity. It's that we put 15 students into a space that is designed to hold 25 or 30. And by the way, the budget as it originally came through calls for buying chairs and desks for 25 or 30, even though we only plan on putting 15 or 20 in the space. And we could ask why we're doing that. So those are the kinds of questions we have to ask. I think what we're going to conclude from this is that never again should we let a project get this far that we could have started 4 or 5 years earlier. I think we have to start them earlier, and I think we have to, before the educational spec, the ed spec is cast in concrete with a rebar installed, I think we need to run it through the finance board and let the finance board get comfortable with the spec so that when the budget comes, it's not a controversy.
And do you think your time as first selectman dealing with Hamilton, Ave, and Glenville kind of helps you out dealing with New Lebanon now?
Well, it certainly does. I learned a lot from watching those two projects. I think in hindsight, probably people would say that the decision to preserve the facade of Hamilton Avenue was, maybe a good call aesthetically, but it made the building more expensive than it needed to be. In the case of Glenville, they had a far lower cost to build that building, in part because they preserved not the facade, but some of the basic structure. Okay. And they had an easier site. The site wasn't as tight. Hamilton Avenue I think we learned from that the way that project was run, that is how it was managed, the relationship of the building committee to the contractor was not really very efficient. Mm-hmm. And so we don't do them that way anymore. And maybe we're going to learn a little bit from what we're doing now and from the recent experience on the high school project, the auditorium, that there are ways to manage the projects more effectively, and that keeps the cost down. So I know Steve Walker, who's chair of the building committee, is thinking a lot about how they hire and manage the contractors who are actually going to do this work.
Great. And now, why do you think it's important to give back to the town?
Well, I often tell people I blame my mother for that. She thought if you lived in a town, you should do something in the town that was, helping the community. She was born and raised and died in the town she lived in, a little town north of Detroit in Michigan. Her father had been a veterinarian in the town and chair of the school board, and he used to say that he was chair of the school board instead of the local medical doctor because the people felt like he was more important than the medical doctor. They used to say, your farm animals are your livelihood, but you can always get more children. So this is, it's a farming point of view of things. I don't know. So anyway, he was chair of the school board, not the medical doctor. I think I grew up with that notion that you were supposed to be doing something in the town in which you lived, and so yeah, that's how I get here. And I have the time to do it. I didn't do this when I was 30 or 40 years old because I didn't have the time. I was traveling all the time.
And how do you think the town can be more efficient with spending?
Well, I think the thing that we do that really works for us is we set guidelines in the fall. Those guidelines are set through a kind of a collaborative process, but in the end the BET publishes guidelines that says this is how much we can afford to spend next year, and these are the kinds of things that we think ought to be the priorities, and that gives the department heads guidance and the superintendent of schools and the school board so that they know that if they stay within those guidelines, they're likely to get all the money they're asking for. But if they get outside the guidelines, then the BET is going to be forced to either raise taxes a lot more, which isn't a very popular thing to do, or start making its own judgments about what our priorities ought to be. And I always say to the department heads and school superintendents, so who do you think should set the priorities, you or me? And they always want to do it themselves. So then we say, well, then you should try to find a way to work within the guidelines. If you think our guidelines are unreasonable, that's something else, and then we can work on that over a period of years to try to make sure the guidelines are workable. But if the guidelines are reasonable, then you should try to adhere to them, which they do, by the way. And so then the BET isn't having to make these kind of detailed judgments, which we're perfectly happy to make them, but we're not necessarily the best people to make those judgments.
And some people have said Greenwich takes on too many big projects at once.
Well, I think that's a question. We're doing a lot more big projects now than we were doing when I was on the BET in the early 2000s. I don't know whether it's too many, but it's a lot. And our ability to supervise them and keep them under control and manage the costs, run them efficiently, is limited by how many people we have. We don't want to hire more people, and so then we end up hiring contractors to manage the jobs, and the contractors don't necessarily know what our priorities are, what our sensibilities are, so then our people have to manage the contractors who are managing the job, and that just adds cost.
Right.
So I think maybe, now I've been kind of back at it for a few months. I think maybe we're trying to do too many things at once.
And how do you think that can be fixed?
Well, it's easy to fix because we have the guidelines process.
Mm-hmm.
So we say to department heads and to the Board of Ed, set your priorities. And we're giving the Board of Ed this year in their budget about $600,000 to kind of plan the next 15 or 20 years of school projects.
Okay.
So set your priorities, talk with us about them before we get to the budget cycle, then we can set the guidelines for the budget in a way that minimizes conflict. There's always a little conflict. That's the nature of if there were no conflict, we'd be doing something wrong.
Yes.
And that'll make the process more predictable for everybody, and then that will make taxes more predictable. And that's kind of the way people want the town to be run. At least I guess it is, because they keep electing us to do it over and over again.
Definitely. And you just mentioned taxes. Do you think taxpayers get their money's worth back in town projects and things that the town funds?
Well, I do. If you think about the way the money is spent, more than half of it is spent in the school system. And if you look at the general condition of our schools, it's much better now than it was 15 or 16 years ago. The maintenance hadn't been kept up, so now we used to spend $1 million a year on maintenance. Now we spend $10 million a year on maintenance, and still there's lots to do. We have a lot of buildings, and we weren't spending enough. So we've caught up on a lot of that. We've built some new buildings. All those are things people can put their hands on and see, and they enjoy them. When you tell them that you're going to spend $10 million to improve a stormwater culvert or replace a sewer line, they can never really see that, so the only time they appreciate it is when it's not working.
Yes.
So that's harder for people to see. The system depends on them trusting the BET and the first selectman and the department heads and the town meeting to think those through and decide if those are right. So, yeah, our mill rate, the rate at which we tax property, is among the lowest in the state, maybe the lowest. But our budget is probably the highest, and that's because we have a lot of valuable property here. But a lot of valuable property, a lot of school kids means we need to spend money to produce the kind of town people want. So, yeah, I think it's pretty good. People say to me, well, why don't you just spend less money? And I say, okay. So that's okay with me. Instead of putting 15 kids in a classroom, let's put 20. And instead of 20, let's put 24. Then we can reduce the number of teachers. 80% of the budget is salaries, so you have to get rid of people. Teachers are more than half the people. Let's get rid of some teachers. And people go, well, no, we don't want to do that. Okay. How about cops? Let's get rid of cops. We're out there patrolling all the time. There's a lot of crime at midnight. Let's put fewer cars out on the street at midnight. Let's get rid of some of those guys. People aren't sure they want to do that. So, we all would like to have lower taxes. That's okay with me. But then we have to say, because I'm data-driven, what are we going to stop spending money on? And is that okay with most people? And in the end, the balance seems to come back to kind of where we are. But there's a conversation about it all the time. The recent election for the head of the Republican Town Committee, in part, was about a group of people who think we're really spending too much. They'd like us to spend less. And, that conversation is going to go on. It's not going to go away.
And what's your favorite part about Greenwich?
What do I like best about Greenwich? Well, I eat out a lot, so I like the fact that as compared to 30 years ago or 35 years ago when I came here, there are now a lot more really good restaurants, and so I use them a lot. And
What's your favorite, maybe?
Oh, I don't know. I always hate to pick favorites.
Okay.
I'm sort of an omnivore, so I probably don't really have a favorite.
Yes. And then, what do you want to see improved for the future of Greenwich?
Well, I'd like right this minute. You're always sort of focused on the brick wall you're about to hit, and the brick wall I'm about to hit is the pricing for the new Lebanon school, and I'm concerned that, as I said to you a few minutes ago, we don't get to looking at what they call the ed spec. The Board of Ed's adopted requirements for the school. We, the BET, don't see that until months after they've adopted it. And so then we're left in this position where we only have two choices, really. Fund the school or just not fund it and not build it and send them back. And at that point, there's all this energy that's got into it. And the parents are all, if you tell them, well, we're not going to give you your school, they want to burn your house down. And I don't blame them for that. The process is not quite in the right sequence. We need to change that so that we don't have this kind of thing happening all the time.
What didn't we ask you today that we should have?
Well, actually, you asked me most of the kinds of things that I think I hear from people around town. The thing that people don't ask isn't quite the right word, is they don't ask, if we really can find ways to run the town at lower cost without somehow giving up services that we really depend on. And, you know, the kinds of things they focus on are other communities in the state, which are high-quality communities like Greenwich, which have far smaller budgets and far smaller governments. And my usual answer to that is, well, we could do that, but people in Greenwich really like to have their hands in their government. You know, if you look at all the committee meetings, all the boards that have volunteers on them, all of the RTM members, you know, the biggest RTM clearly in the state, maybe in the universe, you know, people want to have they don't just want to have a say, they want to participate. And, you know, if you ask me, because I said it years ago, I think the RTM's too big. But try and talk them out of that, you know, it just doesn't work. I think that not just desire, but that sort of need and willingness to get involved in town government isn't a bad thing, it's just annoying sometimes. And, you know, so, you know, if the question is what would I change, I'd probably try to make the government a little smaller, but that's my preference. Clearly not the preference of a lot of other people.
So thank you for sitting down with me today.
Sure.
This was Jim Lash, the chairman of the BET Budget Committee, and for the Greenwich Sentinel, I'm Taylor Knight. We would like to thank Greenwich Community Television for their dedication to the community and for allowing us to share our content with you. And be sure to check the Greenwich Sentinel and GreenwichSentinel.com for the latest news, sports, and events happening around town.